What's up and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name's Erica and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Xenophon context. Now before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Just before diving in, as I say at the start of all of these videos, it is vital for me to reiterate that this is a context video. I am not getting into the text itself. It is just talking about Xenophon, his background, born, raised, the things that we know, and basically try and construct an image of who he was before the videos after this go into the detail of the text itself. Now, I've done this many times on the channel, so if you guys don't know the structure, you can check out my Iliad, Odyssey, Aeneid, Argonautica playlists so that you guys can see what those look like. I have some on the plays as well from ancient Greece. So it's going to end up looking like that. But this video is just about Xenophon himself. Now, speaking of Xenophon, let's actually roll into the topic today. I wanted to start off by saying that I think Xenophon is one of the most interesting ancient people. And the reason is because I've discussed a number of ancient historians and a number of philosophers on this channel already, right? We've discussed Plato at length, we've discussed Herodotus, Thucydides, all of that. And Xenophon is somebody who really, if you are not into military history, you probably are never going to encounter. And I don't mean that in a way that is like you shouldn't read him if you're not into military history. I think that everybody should read Xenophon. I think he's fantastic. But he is somebody who is so niche that you could genuinely go your entire academic career, you go your entire regular historian career, and if you are not into military history, it is a name that you probably will never encounter and never need to. So in watching this video and in talking about Xenophon, you might be one step ahead. So there you go. So who is Xenophon? Xenophon was born, we think, sometime around 430-ish BC, and he dies sometime around 350 BC. Again, as I always say, about 5 years on either side of those, and you're pretty good. And that's because we don't know for certain those dates. Nobody wrote them down. And then when it comes to his death date, we have so many varying dates, sort of kind of around 354, I want to say, is like a really solid one. And then there's some that say it's a little bit later than that. And so therefore, if you just say 350, if you just say 430 for his birth date, you're good. Everyone's going to know who knows Xenophon that you know what you're talking about. His childhood, his upbringing is very, very scantily noted. We don't have a lot about Xenophon at all. Really, we have less than what we know about so many people of the ancient world. So when it comes to him, we can infer a lot, like I always say actually, from what happens later even, in his life. As I frequently mention, the ancient world does not cater to a rags to riches story, and so therefore we can infer that Xenophon was pretty rich growing up. And we know this from his education, not only because he ends up being this incredible writer, but also because he was a student of Socrates. So this period of history is one of the big, momentous Greek moments, big moments even, of Greek history. This is when we have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle on the scene. It is also when we have the Peloponnesian War that is raging in the background between Athens and Sparta, which will come up later in the video. But all of these things are happening around this period, and Xenophon is present for all of them, right? He is around experiencing the environment and experiencing the political landscape, how it changes, and all of that kind of stuff. So he is actually one of the students of Socrates. And this is really fascinating because Xenophon, even though we know him as a military writer, and we will get into that in 1 second after I take this little bit of a detour, he is known as being this military writer, this commander, this general, all of this kind of stuff that he does brilliantly well. And yet, some of the other works that we have from him are Socratic dialogues. He writes his own version of the Symposium, bear in mind, and no one gives gives a shit about it? Absolutely no one cares. We only ever read Plato's. We only think there is one symposium. Xenophon's off in the corner like, no, I have my own, but nobody seems to want to read it. And when it comes to his military stuff, it's so niche that it only ends up being really important when you're reading Latin literature. They are constantly referencing Xenophon and his Anabasis. And that's really because he is in the shadow of Thucydides at this time. So even though the Anabasis is written later, like when he comes back from his whole little expedition, which we'll get into because that's what the Anabasis is about, he then is probably aware that he is in the shadow of the giants like Thucydides and Herodotus and all of these people that are writing around that time. So it means that what he writes about is incredibly niche and incredibly angled, is the word I'm going to use apparently. And it's probably because this moment of history was just so mega and just so big that he was going to get dwarfed by someone, if not everyone. The events that shape the Anabasis really come to us when Xenophon is around 30 years old. And by the way, we don't know who his parents are. We don't know about his family growing up and all this. We know about his later family. But at this point, this is really when we like tap into Xenophon's life. Is around 30 years old. And he and a bunch of other Greek soldiers have been called to Persia to fight alongside Cyrus the Younger. I'm trying not to do this with too much detail because otherwise we have literally nothing to talk about in the series. So this is a very general overview, okay? That we have the Peloponnesian War that's been raging in the background. Xenophon, because he's being taught by Socrates and all this, he is from Attica. We don't really know where he was born in Attica, but he was going to study in Athens because he studies alongside Socrates. And so we know that that's the period where he's from. That's the area where he's from. He ends up, along with a number of other Greek soldiers, going to aid Cyrus the Younger, as Cyrus the Younger, who's a Persian king, is fighting against his brother, Artaxerxes II. Now, we will dive into all the details about that later. So, when they're in Persia, though, this goes horribly wrong. Cyrus the Younger ends up being killed. In fact, a number of the higher-ups of Xenophon's army end up being killed, which means that a bunch of these lower of the people who were killed have to step up, and one of these people is Xenophon. And this is really what takes place in the Anabasis, and this is what we learn about in the Anabasis, is this essentially very long walk, because what Anabasis translates to is the upcountry march, really. It's this very long walk from Persia with all of these Greek soldiers back to Greece. And what the text really details for us is, yes, this very long walk of where they went and how they're going about this and all of this, but the underpinning of this text is what it means to be a leader. Not only a leader of the army, but also the leader in the sense of talking to locals and getting help and all of those sorts of things that Xenophon does so brilliantly as this role when he's around 30 years old. That is what is detailed in this text, and that's probably why it was so freaking niche and is still so freaking niche, because like I said, if you're not in military history, when are you going to have to read a manual about leadership? It does make perfect sense, I must say, even though I'm like, everybody should read the Anabasis. This is unbelievably important. I understand why most people don't. I really do. Now, to fast forward this, because again, we're going to be going into detail as we go through the text, that Xenophon does successfully get everybody back to Greece. However, not all is great when they go back to Greece. That actually a number of them, including Xenophon, go and they decide they're going to fight for the Spartans. This is because when these Greek mercenaries return from Persia to Greece, as mercenaries, they need to find more work, and they end up getting employed by a Thracian prince in 400 to 399 BC or BCE. Now, after this, they end up dotting over to the Spartan service for war to liberate the Anatolian Greeks from Persian rule, and it's there that even though the narrative of the Anabasis shuts off, it is clear that Xenophon makes some sort of connection with the Spartans. And this is most notably with King Agesilaus II. This happens after 396. And when the Greek sort of army, there's a Greek army that's formed against the Spartans, and this includes Athens, by the way, who are against Sparta. And they basically do this little uprising against Spartan authority, against Spartan rule in mainland Greece. It is notable that Xenophon fights for Sparta. Athens and Sparta have been enemies for years. I mean, this is not a united Greece. The way that we view Greece in the modern world is absolutely not what Greece was in the ancient world. And this version of Greece is all of these little different city-states who fucking hate each other. They sometimes ally in order to ward off a bigger enemy, which happens, you know, with the Persian War, they all kind of ally, but they're not friends. And so therefore, when this army decide, oh, some of us are going to go down, we're going to go down to Sparta, the Athenians are like, you are dead to us. Now, because our writing does cut off here, it is unclear whether Xenophon was exiled before or after this moment. We don't know. It's either that in fighting for Sparta, he gets exiled from Athens, or when he returns, he gets exiled from Athens anyways. So it's one or the other, but either way, this results in Xenophon being exiled and not being able to go home. He ends up taking home in Elis, which is just near Olympia. Now, not all is doom and gloom for Xenophon, that we know that he ends up having a wife and 2 children. I did have to write down their names because I am never going to remember them. So his wife is called Philesia. We know absolutely nothing about her aside from her name. And they have 2 sons. One is called Grillus. Not as nice a name. I'm really sorry if that's your name and you're watching this, but rough. And his other son is called Diodorus, which is like a lovely name. So really unfortunate for the other kid. But either way, so he has 2 children and he seems to really thrive in Elis. We know that he has enough money at this point because when they were serving Sparta, they are serving as mercenaries. So they're getting paid in order to do that, if you don't know. So he ends up acquiring enough money that he can actually donate or buy part of the Temple of Artemis down there, so he can give money to that. He also, we know, was putting on lots of public festivals in Elis and serving the community in that kind of a way. So he is really having a good old time, and it's really during this period of exile that he sits down to write the Anabasis. Now, this is not the only text that he has. As I mentioned earlier, he has the Symposium. That was important then. Again, no one cares about the Symposium. Still, to this day, no one cares about his Symposium. He writes the Anabasis, but he doesn't only write that as a history. He also writes the Hellenica, which is another one of his very, very famous works. That's more so a general, like, Greek history text. The main one that people read is the Anabasis, which is his walk, the walk of the 10,000 men. Then we also have the, oh God, I'm pronouncing it Chiropedia or Cyropedia. It is basically about Cyrus, and that is really written as like a companion for the Anabasis. So one is about Cyrus and his teachings, one is about the walk after Cyrus is killed. So he has a number of works under his belt. The one that we're going to be focusing on is the Anabasis because that is the important one, but that is certainly not his only one. Now, the reason why I'm also mentioning these before we get to Xenophon's death is because, as I mentioned, Xenophon is in the shadow of these incredible historians, right? So we have Thucydides, Herodotus, all of those kinds of people. And whenever I talk about the ancient historians, I always want to talk about, you know, not necessarily always the criticisms, but, you know, the commentaries that we have about how the ancients were absorbing these texts. And what I think is really interesting when we look at Xenophon, which is different to Herodotus and to Thucydides. As I've mentioned in those videos, if you haven't watched those, you can find those linked in the description below. But really our problem with them is that Herodotus kind of makes shit up. There are so many problems with Thucydides, mainly that he was in exile as he's writing it, all of that kind of stuff. But the common thing that we have with a lot of texts, especially from this period, is that even though they might be tricky, modern people will look at them and say, oh, they're tricky because it's a different type of Greek, but it's not too tricky. It's not too difficult, right? When I talk about the difficulty of Greek, it's really coming from a modern person who is not Greek and who is learning the ancient language going, what the fuck is a middle voice, right? That's mostly my problem with the Greek. And it's the specificity of the language. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because Xenophon is difficult even to the ancients. I have actually never read Xenophon in Greek, and that's because when you're reading Latin literature, the ancient Roman people who are discussing him are going, holy fuck, this is difficult. Why did he choose this particular piece of vocab? Because it took me ages to get through it. That's how the Latin literature, you know, authors are writing about him, like generally, like not just one, but a number of them are mentioning how difficult he is. But also the ancient Greeks are mentioning how difficult Xenophon is. Just the way that he phrases things, the vocab that he uses, all of that is very, very bizarre. And that, I think, has made him so closed off to a lot of people. And I think a lot of people don't go into his text because of that. But it was also his way, when he's writing of making himself special, of making himself worthy of being read amongst these giants, even though his message on leadership is incredible, and is something that people end up studying. But the main complaint that we have is, oh my god, this is so unbelievably tricky. And this, to come back to the whole narrative of this video, is what he's doing in his exile, right? When he's in Elis, he's writing all of this stuff and he's just being a dick about it, to the point where I still have not tackled it. So actually everything that we're going to be doing is purely from translation, and that is very different for this channel, because normally what I tend to do is I will like go into the translation then check everything in the ancient Greek just to make sure that it's there. This is going to be new territory for me. I will be telling you guys the exact translation that I'm using, and the fact that I have not, if I can check little things I will, but for the most part I'm going to keep my distance. Now, unfortunately, the end of Xenophon's life, though, is not he wrote in exile and then he dies at some point, right? Which tends to be the narrative of a lot of these videos that I'll kind of get to the end. I'll be like, we don't really know. It just ends up dying. What we do know happens is that we have this battle of Leuctra. This is in 371 BC, and the Battle of Leuctra is a really interesting moment, which basically, for long story short, purposes of this video, to keep it nice and brief, the Battle of Leuctra is a signpost in Greek history where it means that the Spartans do not, and Xenophon in particular, does not have authority over the land of Elis. Why is this important? That's because no matter how dedicated Xenophon has been to this particular plot of land, as I mentioned, he's been giving money. We also know that he not only has been doing the public festivals, but he's also been hosting a number of families, a number of people in this area. He's been very good. What I'm trying to say is he's been very good. Despite being in exile, he's been so good to these people and to visitors of this place. But because the Battle of Leuctra happens and therefore there is no authority over this land, his home, his farm actually, Xenophon's farm, is taken from him. And so again, he is sort of flung into, great, I'm homeless once more. This sends Xenophon from Elis back up to Corinth, right? So he goes back up into Corinth. And actually, something that's also happening around this time is that his son, Grillus, the guy that has the really rough name, in 362, he's part of a different battle where he ends up being killed, but he's fighting alongside the Athenians. Now, this is important. So 371 is the Battle of Leuctra. 362, we then have, during this period, Xenophon is in Corinth. Now, what's interesting about this is because his son fights alongside the Athenians actually decide to revoke the exile of Xenophon. There is no evidence that Xenophon actually went back to Athens whatsoever, because we just know that he dies sometime around 350. What he does during this period is not actually written with regards to his movements. We don't know, but again, there is zero evidence for the fact that he did go back to Athens. However, when he does die, there is writing from Diogenes Laertius. I am a classist and I constantly butcher these names. It's up on the screen for this historian who tells us again that there is no evidence for him going home. However, there is evidence for his body. He's the only one who says this, but still there is some evidence for Xenophon's body being taken back to Elis, and that is where the body is buried. And that is the end of Xenophon's life. Now, I am absolutely thrilled for the rest of the series to be going into the Anabasis in particular. My camera keeps going in and out of focus, so I think this is the time that I need to wrap up this video. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments below, but because my camera is absolutely struggling, I will love you and leave you. I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit more about Xenophon today, and we will be seeing you in the subsequent videos detailing the Anabasis. Okay, before my camera dies, see you all next time.